Greetings, friends and fellow freelancers. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletop Mercenary. Today, I wanted to talk about one of the harder decisions that we have to make as creators, as designers, and it's that we have to figure out what products it is people will actually buy, because there are dozens of different types of things we can make for RPGs, but some of them are going to move more numbers than others. Now, before I get into the list and before I start talking about why I think certain things do better than others, I want everyone to remember these are just general trends that I have seen as a creator. These are not hard and fast rules of the universe, nor is this saying that something from one of these categories is guaranteed to be a bestseller, nor is it guaranteed to not sell well, really. Things from a quote-unquote bad category can still do numbers. Things from a good category can still get overlooked and ignored by the audience. These are just general trends and things to keep in mind going forward. But with that disclaimer put in place, I'd like to start with what I think, or what I've experienced, has been the top seller as far as category of RPG material. And that category is lists and tables. And if you're not a game master, this might surprise you, because so many of us, when we see tables and lists and whatnot in RPG books, we just kind of breeze past them and ignore them. For players, they're really kind of an annoyance, and we don't really bother with them a lot of the time, unless it's something that's really important to our character or it's a major and important rule set of the game. For game masters, though, it's important to remember they are really our main demographic. If you're an RPG designer, probably, I saw numbers somewhere, it was 80 to 90% of all RPG materials are bought by the game master, which makes sense when you think about it, because most of the time all a player needs is a base book, and even then, it may be the base book owned by the GM that's being handed around for everybody to use during character creation and level up sessions. So these lists and tables are really things that game masters will pick up, and they'll use them in whatever games they have. As an example, the 100 NPCs you might meet at the tavern, one of my first supplements for Azukail games, is also one of my most popular sellers. And you see other stuff I put together in this vein. We have 100 fantasy foods, 100 sci-fi cocktails. These are all things that game masters can pick up, and they can either roll dice on them as you would with a normal table, or they can just read through them and find the interesting bits of filler that they like and put them in their world and put them in their games. Also important to remember, things like this usually have a really low price point, and this is where the marketing and sales comes into things. Because expensive RPG books, expensive RPG materials, things that game masters or players, because players can get these too, aren't sure they're going to want or need, they're probably not going to pick it up for $30 to $60, depending on how some of those books will go. But for something that's $2.50, $3, maybe even $1, they'll usually throw it in their cart and grab it. It's the equivalent of that junk food you see up near the cash register of. A lot of the time, people will just grab it, throw it in their cart, and get it anyway. They may not even look at it, they may not even use it, but they made the purchase, and that's what matters. And that's also why you kind of need numbers if you're doing these. It's the double-edged sword of the tables and charts of they don't cost a lot of money to sell. It means they also don't make you a lot of money as a creator. So you really do need to move hundreds to sometimes thousands of copies of them, depending on if you're going to make this your bread and butter. Moving on to the next category, we have other forms of GM prep. And it might sound from the description I originally gave that lists and tables is the same thing as GM prep. That's not entirely true. They fill in a lot of details for game masters, but when I say GM prep, I mean modules and extra supplements that give the game master something to put into their game, or they highly detail items, but at the same time, it's not a fully detailed adventure. It's not a campaign for them to actually run. That's another category we'll get to in a moment. But a perfect example of this is a supplement of mine of 10 Fantasy Villages, which has done very well over time. And it doesn't actually give the game master any sorts of story to run, but what it does give them is a map, a history of this area, some notable NPCs, some quest hooks if they want to use them, and it provides sort of a building block you can just plop down in the middle of your game and use, whether you want to use them as a place to find on your journeys, just a place to rest at the inn and trade in your gems and your treasures and pick up some rumors, or they can use it as a base to build their own stories off of. These are the sorts of things that fall into that category, and like lists, they're aimed at GMs, and they are really things that game masters can take to fill in all the gaps and to fill in all of the grunt heavy lifting that they may not want to do to make their story really pop. And it's really helpful, and I find that as a category, again, since we're aiming at game masters, this is something lots of them want to get because it facilitates them telling their stories, but doesn't feel like we are dictating as the creators to them what story they should be telling or how they should be telling it. And that's sort of that middle ground, which is really helpful because it has been my experience. A majority of game masters want to tell their own stories at some point in time. They want to create their own worlds. They want to do things their way in their own little sandbox. So they may not want to pick up something from a fully fleshed universe. They may not want to pick up something that is going to tell them how to run things and sort of relegate them to a backseat driver, which is important to remember. Again, we'll get to that category in a moment. Those are the top two selling categories in my experience, and I have found those are the easiest ones to market. Again, largely because they fill a very small niche that lots of game masters will need, and they usually have a pretty low price point. Of any kind of smaller supplement like this, you're going to sell for a couple of dollars. And again, you're not making much per sale, but if you have lots of options out there, and if people are picking up lots of them, that's going to add up at the end of the month. But then we get into a third category, which is different, and it has lots of things that make it a harder push, as it were. And these are base books. As an example, folks who haven't been watching the channel for a while, my game Army Men came out this year, and it is probably the most expensive product on the list for stuff that I've created or been a part of, honestly. And it's a base book for a fully immersive RPG. You don't need to buy any other books to play this game. You just need this one book. If that's all you want, if that's all you need, go for it. And as products go, base books are one of those things that can be very hit or miss. On the one hand, you kind of need them to play the game. So if you can persuade people to play your RPG, they're going to need at least one base book for their group. If you're very lucky, if they really like the game, every player, or at least the players who have spare money, might get their own base book so that they don't have to constantly ask the GM to borrow their copy. And that can be very helpful, but at the same time, it has a higher price point, which means that you're going to find individuals who may not have the spare cash for it. It's very important in this aspect, I have found, to have a digital copy as well as a hard copy, and to have some kind of bundle deal for the two of them, because lots of people, if they see a game, they may not be entirely sure they want it on their shelf if they haven't played it yet. So they'll want to pick up a digital copy. You know, they'll risk $10 to $11 on this, whereas they would not risk $30 to $50 for a hard copy. But if they do really like the game, if they want to keep playing it after they've had that initial taste, it's very likely that they will buy a hard copy so that they have one on hand so that they can either take it to a friend's and run the old-fashioned way, or because they just like collecting books for folks who have met folks who play RPGs. And again, base books is a category that will be very difficult to gauge because there are so many aspects as to whether or not a game is going to be successful. Because on the one hand, when I originally sat down and made Army Men, D&D 5e was the go-to system for the entire industry. It was nearly impossible to get its fairly rabid fan base to try or play anything else. That has been kind of broken by Hasbro's repeated actions, but at the same time, it's still a system that lots of people know, lots of people are willing to try, and lots of people already have the knowledge base and all of the materials for. So it has pros and cons. Whereas if folks remember the earlier video in this series about the challenges of selling your own system, it can be a lot harder trying to get people to pick up a game system that they've never seen before that, well, of course they've never seen it before, you just made it, but a game they have no experience with that isn't really tied to anything else. So a lot of this is going to come down to salesmanship to whether or not you can get your game into people's hands, whether you can give samples and playtests, whether you have videos of people going through it and enjoying the experience, and just how weird your game is, honestly, because a lot of people will check something out just because it struck a chord or gave them an opportunity to do something that other games haven't or can't. And so this is middle of the road category because there are just so many different aspects of it. It's hard to say whether or not a given base book is going to be successful or not successful. And a lot of that will come down to, does this game have an audience? Has it built an audience? Because the bigger an audience is and the more folks there are that are familiar with the game or that want this particular type of play, the more successful base books and larger supplementary books are going to be. This is when we start moving into the lower category of things that are a much bigger risk, and that it has been my experience, do not move copies as well, with all the usual caveats of if you do not have a rabid fan base, if you don't have people that know you for this, etc., etc., etc. Something that I have personally had a great deal of difficulty moving copies of, and which, as a result, I find difficult to make myself work on because it doesn't feel like there's really an audience for me for it, is adventure modules. Which seems weird to think about because adventure modules are in many ways one of the staples of RPGs. They are the product that all of us are most familiar with. Whether we did community play at our friendly local gaming store, and we showed up for Adventure League or Pathfinder Society, these are probably the most common types of products out there because sometimes you just need an adventure for a starting game master. You need something you can throw together at a moment's notice. So here's a short, contained adventure for people to just run with. Doesn't matter what it is. They come in all varieties of shapes and sizes and styles and genres. And it's really tough for a couple of reasons, in my opinion. One of them, just looking at the market, is there's so many of them that it can be very difficult for your module, your story, to rise above the others, especially if you don't already have name recognition. If you are not known as that person who writes really good modules, you're fighting for space and time and noise with a lot of people. Even if you have folks reviewing your supplement, even if you have all these people leaving positive reviews, it can be tough to be found in that sea. Even if modules tend to be on the less expensive side, they're usually pretty cheap. It can be tough to convince people that yours, out of all the other ones, is the one they should pick up and run for their group. It is also important to remember, as I've been saying throughout this video, lots of game masters like to tell their own stories, and they like to put things together themselves. That's part of the joy for so many people who sit in the big chair behind the screen. And modules, while you can convert them, while you can change them, while you can take aspects of them that you like and use them in your own story in your own way, so many game masters just don't have a use for them. They don't actually want them because, in a lot of ways, they seem to feel like it's cheating almost. The whole store-bought is not fine for some people. They want to do the hard work themselves. And so it's a risk. It's not one that cannot pay off. You can find audiences for modules, but it has been my experience that unless you already have a fan base who is willing to pick up products that you make, modules may not be the best investment for short-term profits. If you are willing to keep making them, if you are willing to keep putting them out, especially if you're going to do them in a series that can be played as a continuous adventure, then you might start getting some people. But as just a standalone thing that you're going to release and you're hoping for profits day one, adventure modules are very risky, and I've even put them below base books at this point because they're so much harder to sell, even with a lower price point, than a fully fledged RPG book. As to our final category, this is something that I desperately wish was not at the bottom of the list because it is one of my favorite things to make, but there is no arguing with numbers. It is really difficult to move copies of tie-in fiction. And I have tried this in a variety of systems, a variety of settings. I have attempted to get people to pay attention in different formats. I've done audio, I've done text, I've done free stories, I've done stories that have a very low price point, I've done entire collections that are book length. Tie-in fiction is one of those things that has always had a very special place in my heart because it is technically the way I got into RPGs of back in the late 80s and early 90s. Tie-in fiction for RPG settings was everywhere, and I loved reading it. I would go to the library and I would get entire armfuls of these books. And even into my teenage years and into my young adulthood, where you had novels for the World of Darkness, or you had tie-ins for Battletech and all of these other game systems, it was something that I assumed was just a part of the industry because so many different companies focused on it, even up to fairly recently with the Pathfinder Tales, which I was part of. It was probably my my first piece of published anything by an RPG company. And it's a thing that I have found of so few people are willing to actually pick up this product. It is exhausting trying to first make something that is going to be very interesting and very useful and that is going to try to suck people into your setting, but then just crickets. And I say this knowing full well that a recent piece of tie-in fiction came out for my own setting, Sundara, Dawn of a New Age. It was Isaiah Burt's latest Blightbane's Gambit, which I do highly recommend folks check out, especially if you like stories of orc mercenary companies and tricksy dragons. But if you want to make this your brand, if you want to make this a big part of what you're doing as a creator, tie-in fiction is a very, very hard sell because you already have the challenge of getting people to buy fiction, which is hard as hell as it is, and then getting them to buy fiction from a setting that is a game. And it's a very... it shouldn't be as niche as it is, honestly. It should be a very simple sell because on paper, it seems like an obvious choice of this is a great way to get people into your game, into your world, into your setting, and it gives supplemental materials for folks who are already fans of your game and your setting, but they may want more stories from it that they don't have the time to play themselves. But it is tough to make any kind of profit with tie-in fiction, and I am not saying don't do it, by all means, but remind yourself that this is not going to be your top seller. Most likely. It can happen, as with all products on this list, anything could become a bestseller under the right circumstances. But when it comes to tie-in fiction specifically, it's probably a good idea to look at it as world fleshing and as supplemental material for people who really like your game, who may need something to tide them over between releases. It is also probably a good idea to market it more to people who like to read fiction than to people who like to play RPGs. Because ideally, tie-in fiction should be a thing that you can enjoy, regardless of whether or not you enjoy rolling funny-shaped dice. But it is not something that necessarily every gamer is going to want. So it's one of those things that has kind of an unclear audience. It could theoretically include everyone, but it usually doesn't. So make sure that you have a focused idea of who you're trying to market your tie-in fiction to, so that when it does come out, you know who to tell about it. But again, as much as I wish this was not the case, it's bottom of the list for a reason. Do not put all your eggs in this basket. By all means, expand into it, but do not depend on this to be your breadwinner. It could happen. It's theoretically possible. But it has been my experience over so many different products that it's just not going to go anywhere unless you are very, very lucky. But that is my thoughts on which products are you most likely to make a profit with in the RPG industry and which ones are more likely to get picked up, and a couple of the reasons why or why not. If you have any ideas for a future topic, if you have anything you want me to talk about, if you are a creator who had an unexpected success with something, let me know about that in the comments. I'm very curious as to why you think that particular success happened. Was it just zeitgeist, the spirit of the time? Was it a particular marketing trick you used? Did you have a certain audience that was really thirsty for this particular type of product that no one would have expected, let us know, especially if you came across a method that you felt upends this list or changes things, or you've had different experiences than I have. These are all things that we need to know and conversations that we should have as creators so that we all end up using our effort on something that is going to actually do well so we can keep doing this. But till next time, it's Tabletop Mercenary, signing off. First and foremost, thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Tabletop Mercenary. If there's a question you have about being an RPG creator, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below so I can address it in a future episode. If you want to help me keep the lights on and keep this show going, then please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and giving it a share on your own social media pages to help boost the signal. Lastly, if you really enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a tip by buying me a Ko-fi or becoming a Patreon patron at the links in the video description below. You'll find me on both sites under the name The Literary Mercenary.